Some of the core features of SM, stem from the fact that there's clear differences in individuals in various settings. A lot of it is how do we teach that skill, and replicate that in many different settings. As parents, many times we're the driver and our kids are the passenger, even our teenagers. So in our treatment, we try to teach many different ways for them to become that driver. There also are a lot of individuals in both categories that have sensory challenges. In large, loud, lots of people environments, they shut down a little bit, and that could feel overwhelming. They could feel overstimulated. So we want to be aware of that.
Welcome back to another episode of the Unspoken Words podcast, a Selective Mutism podcast by the Smart Center, produced and published by New Edition Productions. This episode features Dr. Elisa Shipon-Blum and Dr. Jenna Blum, the director and lead clinical psychologist at the Smart Center's Counseling and Assessments Department, tackling one of the most common and consequential questions we see families face. Does my child have selective mutism, autism, or both? Dr. E and Dr. Jenna discuss why these two conditions are so frequently confused or misdiagnosed, how a child can appear anxious in one setting, yet completely disengaged in another, and what that difference actually tells us. They walk through the core features of each condition, the critical role of the home environment in distinguishing between the two, and the reason behind why a child's silence matters just as much as the silence itself. It's a great episode, and I know you guys are going to love it. If you have any question on anything you hear in today's episode, don't forget, head to selectivemutismcenter.org/ask Dr. E, and make sure you're following the podcast on Instagram and YouTube. We are Unspoken Words _podcast on Instagram and Unspoken Words podcast by Dr. E on YouTube. All right, enjoy the latest episode of the Unspoken Words podcast.
Before we get started with the episode, if you have a child or teen with social communication challenges, listen up. For more than 20 years, the Smart Center has helped over 6,000 individuals overcome selective mutism. Now we're bringing our expertise to you in a new way. With our 6-week virtual social skills series, over 6 sessions, your child or teen will learn through activities, role plays, and real-life practice by learning conversation starters, developing friendships, and managing social anxiety in a safe and supportive space. Our trained clinicians meet every child and teen where they are, whether nonverbal, finding their voice, or already verbal. We run new groups every few months. Visit the link in this episode's show notes to register your child or teen today. All right, enjoy the episode.
Hello, listeners. Welcome back to another episode of Unspoken Words. Hello, Dr. Jenna.
How are you doing?
Good. How are you doing today? And this beautiful sunny day, no longer very cold here in Philadelphia. How are you today?
Good. I wish I could feel it, but I'm just at the office, but I'm sure it's nice and warm.
I am excited for this episode, as I am for all our others, but this is a really relevant episode. We get so many calls to the Smart Center for SM, but we also get a lot of calls. We tend to attract a lot of families with children, teens, and adults with what we call comorbidities, coexisting conditions, in addition to being perhaps a timid child, where the typical treatment of SM is often not as effective, or the child is stuck, not making the progress, and we find out that there's coexisting conditions. There's something else going on that affects the child's social communication, and that's our job. We're all about understanding SM from a whole person social communication standpoint rather than treat to speak. So excited to talk about this episode. It is called, Is it SM, Autism, or Both? So we get so many calls. We see so many kids that are either diagnosed with SM but have autism and maybe don't even have SM, but they may have both. Or they're diagnosed with autism, but they have SM. And these kids are often funneled through the school system, perhaps inappropriately. They're not getting their accommodations and interventions appropriate. They're missing a lot. And these poor kids are struggling year after year after year. And the goal is obviously to figure this out early. So with that said, I'm excited about this episode. What about you? How are you feeling about this? Because you're one of the main clinicians. You're our director of counseling and You're the director of counseling and assessments. And so you are the primary doctor that would be fielding these cases that come to the Smart Center and often doing the testing. You're certified in autism testing with the ADIR. This is something that's a strong focus for you. And in addition to SM, of course. So thoughts?
Yeah, no, I'm excited for this episode because I think this is very common, like you're saying, and I think that it's very needed for us to kind of discuss this a little bit further because I think even in the field in general, I think there's a lot of misunderstandings around the comorbidity between SM and autism. And I think that we get many different evaluations where people share with us, an inconclusive autism evaluation because they were nonverbal during the testing, and they go years without potentially that diagnosis, and then we're able to kind of do a reevaluation and confirm that or dispute that. So, I think it kind of goes in both ways, right? Like, so if you're curious about it and you just want more clarity, we're here to provide more of that. But oppositely, if you had received a diagnosis and it just doesn't feel right in your heart, we're also able to reevaluate and kind of dive deeper into like, yeah, is it really just the selective mutism piece or is it both? So I think that, as all of you are listening, maybe think about which category do you feel like you fall into. And we do hope that this episode is really helpful.
Yeah, no, for sure. Obviously, most of our listeners know about what SM is, but there's going to be some newbies, people that are just coming across this diagnosis of SM. And does my child have SM? Or my child does have SM, but is there something else going on? We have so many episodes on the whys of SM, which is a huge part of what we do because we view SM, as you know, as a social communication anxiety. I do not like the name selective mutism. I think it really gives a false pretense to what this is, and it makes people focus on mutism and hence getting a kid to speak. And that's frustrating because if they could, they would. And the key is to figure out why are they not speaking? Why are they having difficulty with social communication? And address it from the whys and understand the stages of social communication so we can at least start at a baseline to move them. So we have episodes on the bridge, the whys of SM. Welcome you to listen to it, the comorbidities. But this episode, we're going to focus a lot on SM and autism. And more are we seeing this. And kids, people, and families are coming out of the woodwork because they're realizing, whoa, I think my child may have both. And I really want to understand. I think we need to talk about the core features of both SM and autism and kind of start there. So let's talk about the core features of SM, which of course I just talked about, being a social communication anxiety disorder. And it's not willfulness to not speak, but these children, teens, and adults are struggling to communicate and they're mute in at least one setting of their life. But you want to review the core features of SM?
Yeah, I think that, some of the core features of SM, stem from the fact that there's clear differences in individuals in various settings. So in more comfortable settings, they might be more vibrant, they might be more expressive, they might be more elaborative. And then in other settings where they're not as comfortable, like in school or real world settings or with unfamiliar people, depending on the child, they might shut down, right? So there's definitely a big difference in various settings of how much they communicate and what that communication looks like. I also would say that a lot of the reason for why they shut down stems from the anxiety component. So they shut down when they sense an expectation for speech or they sense a different expectation from someone else. And so that is one of the reasons why in those type of settings they shut down. But again, from many other episodes too, there's various whys. So there could be, underlying reasons for why someone does shut down. But
like
again, you see that
being
exactly.
loud. Yeah. So
Exactly. Yeah. But you just definitely like see that difference there. And so, yeah, so I think that also like there's a piece of them struggling with initiation, elaboration, expression. So sometimes, it's not just about speaking, but also just kind of breaking down the amount of speech. We always say like on our social communication bridge, it's like stage 3+, right? So like thinking about why, someone shuts down, or even when they aren't as comfortable, right? They might be fully elaborative at home, but then in school, maybe they do progress to verbal, but maybe just more one-word answers. So just being aware of that too.
And the anxiety, which I talk about often, like the core feature being anxiety, if you have one of the whys, timid being one of the biggest ones, sensory sensitive, having speech and language issues is an issue, being bilingual, multilingualism, and trying to translate the language, feeling that high expectation, having a learning challenge that may affect processing, to be able to process language, to be able to have, the ability to have give, take, back, forth of social communication. All of these whys affect an individual's sense of self, but their anxiety in those situations, because they're not able to do so much of the things that others can do, because this why is preventing it. So it's very important for all our listeners to know that when you're working with treatment providers, really ask, is it more than just being timid? And the key feature for all of this, which we'll talk about with autism, is that these symptoms exist in the home. So a child with speech and language issues may be more comfortable in the home, but if they have an expressive language disorder, they're going to have a difficult time putting their thoughts together and say it. They may get frustrated, open-ended, thought-provoking questions. If they're sensory sensitive and you go to a party and it's loud, large, lots of people, they shut down from the sensory piece. If an individual has, variety of reasons, right? Auditory processing. These symptoms will exist in the home environment. Whereas a timid individual, if there aren't an otherwise, will tend to be more comfortable, verbal, expressive, elaborative, initiative, and very, very typical, neurotypical, and very, very appropriate in the home environment. And then we talk about autism, right? And I want to talk about what is autism and what are those core features.
Yeah. So, autism is a neurodevelopmental disorder. So I think it's really important to distinguish that you're born with autism. It's something that you might see at a very young age. However, as kids get older and maybe there's more demands, you might see a different presentation. So we are seeing that more kids are coming in who maybe are what we consider like our COVID kids, where they might have not seen as many of these things, and just with having more social interactions, they're seeing more of those difficulties. But what I would say is there's almost two categories of autism. So there's the language and communication piece, which again is that biggest overlap with SM, because many times it has to stem from like social reciprocity, how they do interact. Are they having more of these back and forth conversations, right? Like what do those conversations look like? But also even non-verbally. So like gestures, giving a head nod to kind of like clarify that you understood a question, using descriptive gestures like I'm doing now to kind of describe things. So there's definitely different forms of communication. And so we look at a lot of those elements. And then the other side of it is more like the restricted interest and repetitive behaviors. So this could be what sometimes people think of in terms of quote unquote, like those like OCD like tendencies. So like, are there any repetitive behaviors, what we kind of think of in like these compulsions, kind of like this ritualistic way of having to order things or feeling disrupted when maybe your schedule gets altered. There's little changes of routine, all of those aspects. Also some sensory components fall into that category as well, which also is a huge overlap with our SM community. And what I would also say is the biggest feature here is I have many individuals that come in and they might be more shut down. But for someone on the spectrum, if they come in and let's say they're really interested in butterflies, right? I don't know if you can see, but I have many butterflies in my office. And so they might be more shut down, right? I'm asking them questions. And then all of a sudden I bring up like, what's your favorite insect? And it's a high interest for them. And they maybe verbalize butterflies, right? And then they start telling me a story about butterflies, or they start describing butterflies or facts about butterflies, right? So it's not that they necessarily can communicate in various ways, but it's more that when an area of interest is brought up for them, that's where you see more of the elaboration expression come out. So the restricted interest is definitely something that we want to dive deeper into. So I would say like when you think about those two categories, then it kind of gives you more information. But the biggest piece is wanting to make sure that you're paying attention to, is your child having some of these challenges in the home-like setting? And if so, like, what does that look like? Because someone with SM might not be having some of these challenges in the home setting. So when you're seeing that core difference between like the school setting and the home setting, that's a big distinction. But if you're someone on the spectrum, you should be seeing kind of a universal challenge in all different settings. And that's something that we definitely want to capture when we do that further testing.
You really summed it up great. So I really appreciate it. Things that stand out to me is the social puzzle and the motivation. When I'm working with, let's say, a teen that was diagnosed with SM, and I can list, 10 cases in the last month or two that I've seen where they were diagnosed with SM years ago, treated for SM. The SM They may have made some progress, but they're not engaging with peers the way they would expect to be, where parents are frustrated often saying, I don't understand it. He won't talk to his friends. I'm thinking, are they real friends? Like, does he have friends? Or is it over the interest that he's interacting? But it's that social puzzle, like trying to figure out what to say, how to say it, when to say it. The social nuances are so difficult for so many individuals on the spectrum that that will cause anxiety. But like what I see in the office, often are kids that don't even look anxious, right? They don't look that anxious. It's almost like they don't always know what to say, how to say it, and when to say it. And they seem disinterested in same age peers. Mm-hmm. And then you say to yourself, well, is the disinterest a result of their anxiety, their social anxiety? Or is it a result of their social puzzle, the social puzzle they can't figure out, and they've learned to be avoidant that way? So it's very important when you're working with a clinician to really dive deep into this, because we don't expect parents to know unless obviously they're in the field. But this is where getting proper help is so key, because you've got to distinguish between the anxiety for the social puzzle that's hard to figure out versus other reasons for anxiety, being timid. Look, a very socially anxious individual is very avoidant. And as years go on, they do begin to you don't use it, you lose it. You lack the skills and you are a little more delayed in your skills. But then I bring up comfort versus skills. Individuals on the autism spectrum really lack the skills. Mm-hmm. Whereas individuals that are not on the spectrum, when they're comfortable, when you build rapport, when you really work on that through the school accommodations, interventions, through the parents, setting up situations, clubs, activities, small groups, and really building those connections, the friendships naturally evolve. But with autism, it doesn't work that way, that social puzzle. The other key feature that I see, and I'd love you to chime in on this, is the motivation. Typically, I see these kids, and again, I'm thinking about teens, because I think young kids on the spectrum present very differently. Their kind of awkwardness, so to speak, if you want to call it that, social awkwardness, is very, very evident. Whereas as the kids get older, they're almost aloof, disinterested, not engaging. Whereas younger kids, we see it at Communicamp all the time, kind of how they act. They may not even appear, quote unquote, shy at all. They may go up to somebody inappropriately and say something or do something that's like, wait, that's not like socially appropriate. So we'll see these behaviors, the repetitive behaviors, kind of the rigidity. If the schedule's altered, you see them kind of melt down from that, and the behaviors, the extreme sensory issues, things like that. But what I see as kids get older is the lack of motivation for change. And part of it is they're just not interested, for what, like you said, the child or the teen that loves the butterflies. It reminds me of a little boy years ago that came into my office, and we had a ceiling fan at the time, and he was completely mute. Comfort was there. He looked comfortable, smiled, ran over, got a toy, brought it to me, not interested in, not able to speak, didn't speak at all. I knew that he liked ceiling fans, so I showed him the ceiling fan. He lit up like there was no other. All of a sudden, he starts talking full sentences, initiating speech, elaborative, everything. He wasn't very responsive, which was interesting and part of his language profile, but he could just list off the Gettysburg Address, as I call it. So that restricted interest was an area of focus that he progressed into speech with. We certainly utilize it as a big shot role. As we form, you know what I mean? He got involved with, ceiling fans and other things that reminded him those were his interests. Mm-hmm. And many kids with autism, highly gifted, highly intelligent, these areas of interest, whatever that might be. It might be math. It might be reading. It might be trains. It might be anything, a million things are often the areas of interest that they like. And that's where they connect with peers, over those areas of interest. So is it the friendship they're drawn to? Or is it the interest that they're drawn? I know I just said a lot.
Yeah. No,
I mean, this came out, Dr. Jenna, like a lot came out.
Yeah. No, it makes sense. I think I wanted to elaborate on what you mentioned about like motivation, because I do think that is a big factor. And, as you mentioned, like with younger kids, right? I just had a child that came in who we did testing for. And I think, one of the things that the parents really found really useful is it almost feels like we're almost providing a manual, right, of like how to do it, versus for someone with SM, they know how to do it. It's just more that they need those certain skills when the anxiety is so high, but they do have the skill. Like, so as you're saying, individual on the spectrum, they might not have this skill. So a lot of it is, how do we teach that skill and then make it very, and replicate that in many different settings. I think that as individuals get older and you're seeing that like lack of motivation, I think what I see a lot is, and you use this analogy a lot in like other podcasts, where it's almost like if you think of a swimming pool and like this talking piece is in this, like, is this swimming pool, right? They're like like walking around and like you said, quote unquote, look aloof, or like don't really look like anxious at all. But the minute they like, put their foot in the speaking piece, they freeze, right? They shut down. So as individuals get older, and this goes for all teenagers in general, right? Like some kids who are teens that are super avoidant, they might not appear as anxious because they're just not even like dipping their foot in as much. But I think especially for individuals on the spectrum, they've gone years and years without looking at a manual and without learning how to do something. So it's almost like a child who like really wants to build Legos, but then like someone just gives them a bunch of pieces and they're like, okay, well, like make make the Lego set. And it's like, well, I don't have the steps to do it. And that's a lot of times how these individuals feel in terms of the speaking piece. I don't know how to have a back and forth conversation. They were the passenger in the car their whole life. So I think that that's definitely a huge...
Now that you brought up the passenger in the car, we need to explain it, because I think there's listeners
I feel
going,
like we
what do you
explain it
mean
in every
they're the
podcast,
passenger in the car? My 6-year-old isn't going to be driving. What are you talking about?
Yeah, that's true. I feel like I explained this in many podcasts, so shout out to listen to all my other podcasts. But passenger in the car is this component where, let's say you're not actually, but let's say you're just sitting in a car and your child's the passenger and you're driving, right? And you get to a certain location. Let's say you're driving to the Smart Center, right? So the idea is, when you leave the Smart Center, hypothetically, obviously for a 6-year-old, they're not going to do this, but let's say you're like, okay, well, why don't you drive home? Or why don't you get back? And it's like, they look at you like, what do you mean? I was looking at my phone, I was looking at my tablet, I was watching a movie while you were driving. Like, I didn't know the direction. So the idea is, as parents, many times we're the driver and our kids are the passenger, even our teenagers. So in our treatment, we try to teach many different ways for them to become that driver
in their social communication journey.
Exactly. So I think that
I think we need to clarify. I think we have listeners going, I'm still confused.
I don't think so, but maybe.
Okay, well, I don't know. I mean, I know
I don't know if that's... I don't know. I think it's pretty clear, but maybe. But yeah, we're not physically talking about
possible, because I feel like this is such a subtle thing, but how many listeners listening are going, oh my gosh, that's me. I do tell my child what to say, how to say it, and when. I'm constantly saying you need to, you should. I'm constantly telling them where to go, how to go, what to say. And this is not even related to the spectrum. Of course it is, but I'm saying that these are all kids, right? Yeah. The key for kids with SM, social communication anxiety in general, because that's our focus, right, is to help them become more of the driver in their social communication journey. And it might be frontline, where parents are naturally encouraging frontline and handover takeover and giving them these roles and stepping back and helping them become more independent individuals in their life in general. We see too often kids are just kind of the passenger. Their older siblings, their friends are talking for them. And like you said, they don't learn the steps. And for kids with SM, the anxiety piece alone, right, without the autism, when they're comfortable, I'm going to give you an example. I have a 13-year-old, or was working with a 13-year-old, and she had come having been diagnosed with SM. And I clearly saw pretty early on, I guess it was at our intensive, that she really lacked the social know-how. She would say something, she was verbal with some kids, but it was like awkward, right? And she really struggled with the initiation, the elaboration. She just couldn't figure it out. And the mom was incredibly frustrated and she was upset. And that didn't help the child, because she felt that anxiety from the parent. Anyway, we could clearly see this was an autism case, a level 1 autism. And we recommended the testing, and clearly autism. We had to create what we call roadmaps, SM roadmaps, I call them. So like if somebody was having a couple friends over, right? And she had a couple friends. The mom had worked really hard on that. She had some neighborhood friends she'd known for a long time that cared about her. So they were very accepting of her, but we arranged more get-togethers because as kids age, as we know, many kids that are neurotypical may go on and do their other things, whereas the child on the, that's got either SM alone, or autism, they may go separate ways. And kids naturally begin to separate out around those middle school ages. Well, anyway, she really struggled with the kind of the order of events of what to say, when to say it, and how to say it. So what we did is we worked on this get together. She wanted to have this baking, cookie making get together. And so she invited her friends over. We literally had to map out every aspect of the greeting that friend, suggesting what they're going to do, asking questions. And we did what we call the roadmap, but then we integrated what we call sandwich questions. The greetings at the top, the greeting, goodbye at the bottom. And what could someone ask? What's your answer? What else could you say? We integrated that into these mini social situations within that 2.5 hour event. And let me tell you what a success it was. She wrote out the roadmap. She felt so good about it, increased her confidence. She had a couple friends come. One came at 12:45, one came around 1. So she spread it out because she got overwhelmed. What a success that event was, Dr. Jenna. That mom called me that evening oh my God, I couldn't believe my daughter. She became so comfortable. She was excited. She seemed like almost a different kid because she had control. Mm-hmm. She knew what to say, when to say, and she was motivated for this. She wanted friends, but she also lacked the know-how. So there was a motivation, but she didn't always understand what she was motivated to do because it was hard for her.
Yeah.
But she wanted to make the cookies with these girls she knew. See what I mean?
Right.
But anyway, I'm just sharing examples because listeners love examples, but that roadmap of being the driver in the car. And instead of the mom saying, well, let's do this, do that, do this, do that, which she said to me, gosh, I would have normally have done that because she wouldn't have known what to do. Mm-hmm. So now we're training moms, step back. Let's give Rebecca the chance to write this out. We wrote it out. We had the worksheet. She did it, sent it back to me, loved it. I mean, it was amazing. These are the things we do in therapy. It's not just lower anxiety and voila. Because for kids on the spectrum specifically, the anxiety isn't always the issue. It's the social piece. It's the social puzzle.
We'll get back to the episode in a second. You're exhausted from advocating, explaining, and hoping someone finally understands. Well, we do. This summer, consider Communicamp for you and your family. Communicamp is the Smart Center's intensive all-day treatment program designed to help children and teens ages 3 and up build social communication confidence. Over the course of one full weekend, your child or teen receives 15 plus hours of expert-led skill building, while parents receive 15 plus hours of training and support. Our clinicians use Dr. E's evidence-based treatment, SCAT, that's helped thousands of individuals find their voice. Here's what matters. Unlike other programs, your child or teen doesn't need to talk to come to camp. We meet them exactly where they are. We have 3 Communicamp weekends happening this summer, June 26th to 29th, July 16th to 19th, and August 7th to 10th. Visit the link in this episode's show notes to learn more. Stop waiting for your child or teen to grow out of it. Make it happen this summer. All right, let's get back to this episode.
I think one of the reasons, it gets a little bit challenging sometimes, and what we kind of want to shift into is how do we differentiate between SM and autism, right? And I think one of the reasons it's really hard sometimes to know if it's one versus the other, if it's both, is because many individuals, both on the spectrum and with SM, have difficulty speaking in certain settings, right? So they do. But again, the reasons for why they do are vastly different, right? And that's also why our approach is so unique, because we look into those underlying whys in all aspects, right? So we want to understand, why is someone shutting down? But for many individuals, both on the spectrum and with SM, they do. There also are a lot of individuals in both categories that have sensory challenges. And that doesn't mean that it's as extreme as a sensory processing disorder, but we do have many individuals that in large, loud, lots of people environments, they shut down a little bit, and that could feel overwhelming. They could feel overstimulated. So we want to be aware of that. And also that could also be individuals that just are super sensitive or like perceptive in general. So it doesn't have to be necessarily like sensitive to sensory aspects, but also just like being very aware of their surroundings. And then there also are individuals that might have more of those restricted interests, but for individuals on the spectrum, again, that could be a component of like one aspect that they, feel more comfortable in. So for both people with SM and autism, there could actually be like this restricted interest piece. But the biggest difference is that is a key component of someone on the spectrum. And that's something that, they're very fascinated by and they repetitively want to engage in that way versus someone that has SM. It's just an area of confidence for them. So when their anxiety is super low, it's an area that makes them feel more comfortable. They're able to become more expressive. So there's, again, a different reason for why they might be engaging in those behaviors. Also, both of them might limit their eye contact when they're not as comfortable. But I would say the biggest factor is someone on the spectrum, you'll see a universal lacking of eye contact versus someone that has SM mostly will lack eye contact when the social communication anxiety is there. But then at home or in a space where they're comfortable, they're fully having that, eye contact, everything is totally fine. So, and then I also would say the last factor is both of them could seem more quote unquote shy, right? They might be a little bit more reserved. But again, the reason for why could look very different. So I guess overall, I just want to explain that, like, even though a child with SM, might look like they're avoiding, others, or, a child with autism might look like they're quote unquote just shy, I guess what's causing the shutdown looks very different. So we want to kind of unpack that. But again, there are definitely those comorbidities. So if you're hearing both these things and you're like, this is still kind of challenging, my child is both of them, that's kind of why we're here to really differentiate.
Yeah, no, that was just a lot of great information. So thank you for that. Let's talk about SM and ASD, the key differences.
Mm-hmm.
So let's kind of go through that because I think this is really important. So when you have a child that isn't speaking, the anxiety with SM, one of the whys often being timid, but other reasons for whys, the speech and language, et cetera, that we talk about, learning challenges. But with autism, the communication differences may not understand. So it's lack of almost understanding versus those other whys of not being able, like the anxiety stopping them, right? So even though kids on the spectrum may appear to be anxious, and they are, don't get me wrong, their understanding is the key feature, which we talked about. We talked about motivation. I would say if you had two kids that are the same age, the motivation for social interaction is much higher. I want to play with basketball with my friends. I want to sit next to my friend at lunch. You see that interest in really a friendship piece. You see wanting to connect. Parents see it. They're excited. They get elated when they're with someone they like, or we introduce them to somebody through activities of interest, and naturally they bond and friendships are there. And, oh, I want to have Rebecca over. It's sort of like that. Whereas individuals with autism, again, that lack of interest. I'm thinking of an 8-year-old child. She's sitting in class. The kids are like laughing over something and she's just kind of sitting there. She doesn't engage with the peers. She does her schoolwork, but you see the lack of, like, she's not really connecting with the peers, like consistently. Doesn't connect, just kind of does her own thing. And it's not the anxiety stopping her. It's not like she's peering out to the side, looking at kids playing and really wanting to play. It's like she's not interested. It's not an interest to her. This may be more extreme in the sense that there's families listening saying, well, my child is on the spectrum and she wants to connect. Well, that's great. I'm not saying all kids don't. I'm saying this is what we see often in kids on the spectrum, that lack of social kind of interest. And having SM, if they have both, which most of our families do, because if they weren't mute, they probably wouldn't have come to the Smart Center. It is really that, like, kind of dual presentation. So again, it's pulling it apart and seeing what's the overwhelming theme here. And does this child meet the criteria for autism? Because usually they meet the criteria for SM, as we wouldn't be seeing them. And of course, the consistency across settings. It exists in the home. These symptoms exist in the home. They may not be as extreme, everyone, but they exist. So the things that you see on the autism spectrum are in the home.
Yeah, no, I think that we've already kind of like explained all these things, but I definitely think That's the biggest factor, is you're going to be seeing a lot of this challenge at home. One of the things we're going to also talk about is like when we do the evaluations, like what that looks like. And one of the biggest aspects that I always look into, which surprisingly a lot of other centers don't do this, is I like to get a lot of videos, and like in your home setting, what does the communication look like? What do these interactions look like? Because again, when you do an evaluation with someone with SM, there could appear to be many different challenges, which again could overlap with what we see in the autism population. But the biggest factor is you're not seeing this challenge in many other settings. So if they are still seeing this challenge, it's more likely that it's not the anxiety component, but rather this social puzzle like you're explaining, and we're still experiencing a lot of that challenge in the home environment.
So having that neurodivergent symptoms within the home environment as well. And we talked about, let's say, response to familiarity. With warm up, kids with SM without autism tend to get comfortable, and communication may progress with strategies that are, don't wait, facilitate. Parents, teachers, etc. are facilitating social communication, bringing them into social communication through the goals, through the games pretty well. It's not being held up by something else. Whereas with familiarity, social communication still persists challenges with the autism spectrum. Even when they're familiar with somebody, you see that. Often with SM alone, without autism, speech and language tends, unless they have an underlying speech and language difficulty, which, we'll figure that out with the evaluation, but it tends to progress, elaborative, initiative, expressive, whereas on the spectrum, there may be more delays than typical kind of echolalia. Will you explain to the listeners what echolalia is? Because we see that.
Yeah, I mean, echolalia is when, like, if I were to say, like, what's your favorite color, a child will repeat color. Or if I were to say, like, what is, an activity that you like, right? Like, so it's kind of like they're just repeating what they're last hearing. They're kind of just being very repetitive in those statements, and it's not as much of the processing in terms of the language. There also are a lot of individuals that, and this is very interesting on the spectrum, where they're narrating a lot of their speech. So I have many individuals that are like shut down with me. This actually just happened yesterday in the office, where a child was coloring and I was trying to engage with them. Again, this is a child that has the comorbidity of SM and autism, and they were very shut down to me. They were not engaging with me, as if I kind of weren't there. Then as warm up kind of came, they were like smiling a little bit, but again, they were kind of smiling towards themselves. And a lot of times, quote unquote, that could be because they're in like their own world, and maybe they're thinking of a silly video that they watched earlier. So it's like, even though I'm in that presence, that is not shared enjoyment. It's more like they're kind of in their own space. But anyway, we were kind of just like coloring, and all of a sudden the child starts whispering, like what he was drawing, right? So he was kind of talking about, like, this is pink, this is, now I want to kind of move over here. Oh, this is like my favorite show. Like it was just kind of like a narration of what they were doing. So, so speech could still be there, but it's more like, who is the speech towards? And so there are individuals on the spectrum that will speak around, but it's not necessarily to get to that other person.
Which is why some of the strategies we utilize are ways to engage with others. So when we're developing treatment plans for both SM and autism, we do involve give, take, back, forth, social communication, whether it's interviews, whether it's games of interest, like I color red, you color red, or whatever it might be, that reciprocal. We actually have to teach them and set these scenarios up because it isn't as natural for them. Exactly. So what we do in school, what we do in small groups, with aunts and uncles, we may form these games or activities that involve back, forth, give, take, because it's not natural. Mm-hmm. And even for kids with SM that aren't on the spectrum, just to kind of what I call break the ice, to get them started, because they may remain socially avoidant, they may remain mute until we put these different games and activities or goals or assignments for older kids in front of them. So it's not just, listeners, lower anxiety and voila, it occurs. It's not just buddy up the child or a small group. It's what you do, how you do it, when you do it, and with who you do it. And respecting the stages and the comorbidities or the whys. And I just had to plug that because I just want people to understand that you're in the trenches figuring out what these strategies need to be for that individual to help them build the social connections and progression of communication. So with SM, you're talking about reducing anxiety, building social communication skills as we're talking about it through the activities, but it comes more naturally because it's innate in them. Whereas with autism, it's way more building those skills step by step by step, and also with the social understanding and helping them with flexibility, because many are very rigid. Any changes, something as simple as a hi bye. I remember working with this boy. He was a teenager and mom was just super frustrated. His goal was to say, to goodbye to people. He just didn't do it. He had no motivation to do it. Whereas when they said bye, he could speak. That's what's interesting. It wasn't about he just was disinterested. So they had nothing to say. And so it would frustrate the parent because the child wasn't doing it. But the child I just watched him look at his mom I don't understand why I need to do that. Well, it's manners to say goodbye. I understand when anxiety is stopping them, we may put hand up or high five, but this child could speak. He could turn to that one kid and go, give me the red crown, or give me the book, or I want to go here. So that's what's interesting too. Many individuals that I see on the spectrum can just almost pop into speech sometimes. They just pop into speech. They can all of a sudden become initiative and elaborative over something of interest for them.
Yeah. So I was going to say, when we think about our social communication bridge, right, there's this back and forth, right? There's the responding piece and then there's the initiation piece. And I feel like in many of the episodes, we talk a lot about how 90% of the time or 95%, it's responding's always easier than initiation. But the one population I find sometimes it's different is on the autism spectrum. Because you're saying, if we need something or it's an area of interest, we will go out of our way to be oh, when can I go to the bathroom? Or I want a break now. Right. And so some people might be oh, wow, they're working on their initiation skills. But the minute you ask them a question, they shut down.
Yeah, no,
right?
this is a great point. You're absolutely right. I see this a lot, whereas we have to work more on initiation with someone not on the spectrum, whereas kids on the spectrum can be more initiative, but not as responsive.
Exactly. Yeah. So that's definitely a huge differential. We see this a lot at Communicamp where, in those structured activities, which again, for someone with SM is so beneficial, right? To have structure, routine, consistency, predictability, which I would argue is still good for both populations, but definitely for individuals on the spectrum, sometimes that structure, if it's not an area of interest or not something that they're ready for, that's where they're still kind of in their own world. They're shut down. They're kind of just still in that present moment, just focusing on what they want to do. Versus the other child with SM might be physically stuck, right? But really wants to engage and learn those skill sets. So I think it's kind of again, you will see a variation. But I also think, emphasizing that it is a spectrum, right? So the higher functioning someone is, and the more attuned they are to their feelings, their cognitions, why this might be harder, wanting to kind of learn. I mean, that again, it really depends on the individual, but I would say that overall, there's definitely sometimes these vast differences, and we want to highlight that. So that way, when we go in and we do an evaluation, we can really make a distinction of, is this SM? Is this autism, or is it both? And like you said, most of the time, we're getting people that are just SM or kind of that comorbidity of both, because sometimes we get the autism piece, but most of the time it's because they are shut down in certain settings.
They're mute. They're not speaking, so they're attracted to us for that reason. So it's like you said, it's kind of the both, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's important to talk about how kids on the spectrum can mask, right? Yeah. Especially girls. Can you just touch on that? And then I want to get into the evaluation process before we're done.
Yeah, I mean that's a really loaded question for the end, but
so you mean it's too loaded for 30 seconds?
Well, no, I'll give a little bit of a overview. But masking is basically when individuals on the spectrum have the ability to, develop different skills to almost kind of camouflage within their community. So they learn these different skills to be able to function, maybe have a back and forth, but it doesn't come as natural for them. And again, many times research has found that women tend to do that more than men. I would say that we see masking more as individuals get older. I do have a lot of individuals that I work with. Like I just had a 10-year-old who did an evaluation for, and actually we ruled out autism. And one of the reasons was mom was saying like, she masks a lot. So like she does have a lot of this dysfunction, this, that, and the other. But one thing to think about is a child who's that young doesn't have the capability of cognitively thinking through like why they're masking. So if they are masking, the question I would ask is it that they're masking, or is it actually that they have this skill set, but there's various times or places where maybe that skill set becomes too difficult, and that could stem from like a higher anxiety. So I think that masking becomes more common as we get older. I would say like between teen years and higher is when I usually will introduce that.
Absolutely. I'm thinking of a young adult that I've worked with. Wonderful. She wanted to be a teacher, so she got through school, got her teaching degree, was working in a school. But her frustration was she did want to connect, but she didn't know how. And so the teachers were getting together in the evening time, going to a happy hour. She couldn't connect to even go to these things.
Yeah.
During lunch, she found herself sitting alone because it was too difficult to know what to say when they sat and had lunch. It caused her tremendous stress. So the anxiety wasn't what, the anxiety was in the moment of not knowing what to say. So she became more avoidant, and she was very upset by this. This was somebody, interestingly enough, that had been diagnosed with SM and autism was never brought up. But when you really saw this picture, it was an autism picture. She was masking over the years as she got older, and she really she didn't have any real friendships when you really questioned the family for years. Never had a friend. When she was younger, mom said, which I think confused the picture, is that she had friends. Well, guess what? They weren't real friends. It was over an area of an interest. It was going to an art class. So she associated or doing art when they came over. It was the activity that was of interest. It wasn't the connection, the social connection. Anyway, I suggested autism testing to this family that I started working with. And needless to say, level 1 autism, very clear. And you know what? It was very validating to that young adult. Yeah. Because now she understands this is part of her presentation of the neurodivergence and why this is hard. There's nothing wrong with her. It's just hard. So we have to work on it. But she had so many other gifts. She was an artist, such an artist. She was amazing with animals and volunteered in an animal shelter and took in, foster animals. And she was just, people loved her. Her students loved her. So she did well with younger kids, which is why I think she was drawn to teaching, which is interesting. But the interaction amongst the staff forming, and she wanted she would love to have had a romantic relationship. She couldn't even think about that. Yeah. So again, you may not know for years, but it becomes a very validating situation. Let's talk about the evaluation process. At the Smart Center, we do something called the Selective Mutism Evaluation, which easily can be found on our website, selectivemutismcenter.org, in Getting Started. But we do this because it helps us understand and conceptualize an individual's presentation. It's not child's mute, adult's mute, whomever. Let's get you to talk. Let's, build some comfort and yada, yada, yada. They begin to verbalize. I don't know how to do it that way. I need to understand that individual. I need to know what their whys are or what may be contributing. I need to understand parenting style for kids and teens. I need to understand their baseline stage of social communication from setting to setting. We need to understand that. We need to understand, what are they doing in school? Are they completing tests on time? Are they interacting with peers? What are their interests? We need to understand the whole person. What else is going on that is contributing to that individual's social communication challenges? Once we have that, we will screen for all of the whys. So it's beautiful because it gives us an understanding to start with treatment, but also school-based accommodations and interventions. And so the SMI, the SMI is the Selective Mutism Interview. It's really what we do in states we're not licensed in, but, we do the SME as a way to get started with treatment, or the SMI, and school-based accommodations, interventions. That's where we'll pick up on a lot of this, unless a family comes to us and says, I'm questioning this, or my child's been diagnosed with it. And I've had kids diagnosed with autism that never had formal autism testing. In the last year, I'd say 3 or 4 cases came to the Smart Center child was diagnosed with autism when I didn't see autism when we did the testing, when we actually did the formal testing for autism, the ADOS, the ADIR, and the other tests we do that we often do if we need to, there was no autism. But because of the selective mutism presentation and the similarities that you may see between the two, child was diagnosed with autism, didn't have autism.
Yeah.
So it's not, you have to think of that too. Were there formal tests to assess this individual? Talk to us about it. Look, this is one of your specialties, testing for autism. Talk to me.
Like, again, we can obviously talk about this with families who maybe have more questions, and that could definitely be something that we could talk about, to kind of have more extended time. Like you said, I do think there's a lot of individuals that do get the diagnosis, or maybe their diagnosis becomes inconclusive because they're mute. So we could definitely, do further testing. I think after we observe your child and maybe we make that recommendation based on whether we observe them at Communicamp or in one of our intensive treatments and we're kind of seeing some of the behaviors, we do many various ways, like many different things that we can, assess them. And that includes a parent interview, which is our ADIR. It includes our ADOS, which is, the in-person testing. We also have adapted a virtual platform, which is the Avabo, which we can actually assess individuals from many different states that we're licensed in. And again, we would make that decision if we feel like your child is, able to participate virtually.
Or an adult.
Or an adult. And then, like I said, we also have various videos that sometimes we might gather. We have like different, questionnaires, something called the GARs that we'll utilize as well. So there's many different ways that we collect a lot of this information. But I would say the first step is completing the SME or the SMI, depending on your state and country. And then we would help guide you in that next step.
Yeah, no, this has been very helpful. And I think our listeners got a ton of information. Excited to have more of this on the website as well. And thank you, Dr. Jenna, so much for your time. I'm always honored to have you join me on this podcast. You're amazing.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I hope
You
this
didn't
is
say
really helpful.
I'm amazing.
You're amazing too.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
All right,
Thank
listeners, please look at the show notes for resources and any questions. Please reach out to the Smart Center. Talk with your local provider about any of the things we talked about. If you think you need further evaluation, many of you work with providers that can do these evals or locally, but we're here if you need us. Thank you for this amazing opportunity. Have a wonderful, wonderful day.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Unspoken Words, a Selective Mutism podcast hosted by me, Dr. E, and the Smart Center. This episode and all episodes of Unspoken Words is produced by New Edition Productions. Don't forget to submit any questions you have from today's episode using our Ask Dr. E form on our website. Just head to selectivemutismcenter.org/ask-DRE. I'd love to answer your question in a future episode or blog post. Remember, for the best of this episode and every episode of Unspoken Words, please follow the podcast on Instagram and YouTube. We are at Unspoken Words _podcast on Instagram and Unspoken Words by DRE on YouTube. Or join our newsletter for additional SM content. We release new episodes every other Monday at 6 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. We'll see you next time.